So it's been a tough couple of months during COVID, hasn't it? And despite we thinking that 2020, that we'd got rid of it, it came back like a yo-yo and hit us right between the eyes, didn't it? And despite many of the negative aspects of COVID, the death, the loss of jobs, and some extreme loneliness, with a bit of consideration, there were quite a few upsides too, weren't there? Working from home seems to be here to stay. The roads were a lot emptier. The environment's been a little bit cleaner, and we spent a little bit more time with our families. And we could spend more time to think about what really matters, such as the Bible, the kingdom, praying and study. And all of this was achieved by the insides of your very well now lived in homes. You're probably sick and tired of your homes by now because you've seen much too much of them over the last 4 months. And although you might think that they are your own prison, it's something that 1.6 billion people in the world don't have, their own dwelling place. Now, our homes are obviously our pride and joy. As I'm slowly learning over the last few months, they are safe places, and we need to put a lot of time and effort into them. And we spend hours and days trying to perfect their practicalities, their aesthetics. It allows us to live in peace and safety, raise children, cook with ease, store our most treasured possessions, and sleep sheltered from the harsh elements. And this, of course, doesn't come cheap. The fact that most of us here are living in Sydney, we know just too well how expensive real estate is. These houses of ours are quite pricey. Just think about the cost of your house and how many sales you needed to make, how many pipes you needed to unclog, or how many light fittings you had to install just to ensure that you had this comfort over your heads. Now, when we're thinking of owning our own houses, India isn't the first place in the world that we think for having prime real estate. It has a huge disparity of wealth, where some of the poorest individuals in the earth are. And then there's also a man called Mr. Mukesh Ambani, the CEO of Reliance Industries. Now, this man, Mr. Ambani, has the title of having the second wealthiest house in the world after Buckingham Palace, but he has the most expensive house owned by a single individual. According to Forbes 2021, he was worth 92.6 billion. Measly, I know. And he's spent $2 billion on his family home. Yes, that is 2 billion with a B. The whopping structure is about 27 stories, although those 27 stories have very high roofs, and so they say the true size of it's actually a 60-story skyscraper. And it's structured on a 400,000 square foot block of land in prime neighborhood in India, with huge levels of grandeur, marble rooms, a theatre, 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. I don't know why he needed to create the extra 2, a spa, a yoga studio. The house is also meant to withstand an 8.0 earthquake, has entire levels dedicated to a go-kart track, and it also has a room which creates its own artificial snow from the walls. And within all of this, 6 of those 27 stories are dedicated to a garage filled with literally hundreds of Lamborghinis, Rolls Royces, and Mercedes, which he's never driven twice. Now, from a house, you can really tell the type of person that lives in it. For Mr. Ambani, his luxury shows his love of wealth, his indulgence in motor vehicles. And for us, we have our own little indulgences too, don't we? Whether they're family pictures, whether they're gadgets, or they could be Bible quotes. Now, we've read this morning from 1 Chronicles 17, where King David, the man who we have studied closely over this year, through the readings, he has been sitting in one of the most wealthy houses in the Middle East. And he's sitting in his dwelling place, and he thinks to himself in verse 1, "Lo, I dwell in a house of cedars, but the ark of the covenant of Yahweh remaineth under curtains." And so here we stumble across an incomprehensible mystery in David's mind. Here he is, a man, king of Israel, yes, but still a man, who has dug his roots, has his roots dug in humility. He came from a shepherd boy out in the back streets of Bethlehem. He never forgot these origins. He often describes himself as a worm, a flea, as the dust of the ground. And yet this flea dwells in a glorious house, whilst the God of heaven and earth, who created all things, lives betwixt curtains of cloth. Barely a house at all. We see David reflect on his praise to God in the previous chapter. If you'd like to glance over in 1 Chronicles 16, where he notes that the whole earth is Yahweh's and sings praise to him. So 1 Chronicles 16, verse 30 to 32. Fear before him, all the earth. The world shall be stable, that it be not moved. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, and let men say among the nations, Yahweh reigneth. Let the sea roar, and the fullness thereof, let the fields rejoice, and all that he is therein. David, king of Israel, is in awe that the king of the heavens and the earth has no permanent dwelling. And so David here, I believe, feels almost a sense of guilt about this. Now, this idea has been on David's mind for a while now, and we see that in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16. This is all about David bringing the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence, from the house of Obed-Edom to Jerusalem. And David doesn't bring it to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. He instead moves it into Jerusalem, his own city. Why? Well, because David, I believe, wants God to basically be his next door neighbor. He wants God, the presence of Yahweh, to be as close to him as feasibly possible. We won't look into it today, but David recognizes that Jerusalem has extreme importance, that it was the place that God intended to set up back in the law, and David wants this place to be his home too. And so David expresses this desire to Nathan the prophet, his intentions of wanting to build Yahweh a house, God of all, a house to dwell in. Now, we know the story well because we're so familiar with the promises that we study in the first principles in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And we know that despite David's good intentions, God tells Nathan that he must deny David's request. Now, the question is then for us, what was the reason that God denied David this opportunity to build him a house? Why did God disallow David from this thoughtful and spiritually uplifting work? I can guess the likely unanimous answer going across your minds right now is that, well, David was a man of war. He was a man of blood, and God required a man of peace to build his temple. And this, of course, was fulfilled through his son Solomon, which is obviously meant to typify our Lord Jesus Christ building our future temple, being the man of peace he was and is. And you'd be right in that answer. However, no matter how much you scour, you'll not find a single mention of it here in 1 Chronicles 17, nor in 2 Samuel 7. This principle is actually listed over in 1 Chronicles 22. So turn over with me to 1 Chronicles 22 and verse 7 to 9. First Chronicles 22, verse 7. And David said to Solomon, "My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build an house unto the name of Yahweh my God. But the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly. Thou hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build an house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest, and I'll give him rest from all his enemies round about. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days." And this too is repeated by David on his deathbed in chapter 28, verse 3, where he says, "God said unto me, Thou shalt not build an house for my name, because thou hast been a man of war and hast shed blood." But as I said, the problem is that this is simply not the recorded reason why God denies his request in 1 Chronicles 17 or 2 Samuel 7. And because it's not mentioned here, I believe this cannot be the primary or fundamental reason behind God disallowing David to build him a house here. So let's go back to 1 Chronicles 17 and let's take a look at the reasoning God does give to David why he tells him he can't build him a house for his glory. So starting at 1 Chronicles 17, verse 4 to 6. Go and tell David my servant, thus saith Yahweh, thou shalt not build me an house to dwell in. For I have not dwelt in an house since the day that I brought up Israel unto this day, but I've gone from tent to tent and from one tabernacle to another. Wheresoever I walked with all Israel, spake I a word to any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people, saying, why have ye not built me an house of cedars? So firstly, God makes it very clear to David that he should not build him a house because he's never needed one, nor has he ever asked for one for that matter. And it's true, this is the creator of heaven and earth. The greatest of mankind's architecture could never house Yahweh, our God. But I don't think that's the point here. This isn't God saying to David, well, I haven't asked you for one because anything you men build would be unworthy. No, that's not the lesson God is drawing here. In fact, God is drawing David's remembrance to recollection that he has never had a physical, permanent dwelling place. And that word, tabernacle or tent, literally, that's what it means. It means a dwelling place or a residence. He's causing David to look back on Israel's history and to consider, when have I ever asked or required a physical dwelling from Israel? In essence, God is saying, I don't need it, and I never have. But there is a phrase that we almost skip over in verse 6. Wheresoever I walked with all Israel. And perhaps just lock that away for the moment. Now, God continues on in verse 7 to 9, and he says, now therefore, thus shalt thou say unto my servant David, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, even from following the sheep, that thou shouldest be ruler over my people, Israel. And I've been with thee whithersoever thou hast walked, and have cut off all thine enemies from before thee, and have made thee a name like the name of the great men that are in the earth. And I'll ordain a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, and they shall dwell in their place, and shall be moved no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness waste them any more as at the beginning. I believe here stems the real answer as to why God denies David's request to build him a house. Just remember, why was David wanting to build God a house? He wanted God to be as close to him as physically possible. He has such a relationship. We know this because we see how David lives his life. He's got a relationship with his God like no other. And what God is telling him here is God doesn't dwell in a house. God dwells within people. He walks with them, just like a shepherd walks with his sheep. He is the one who sets up their habitation. And God is saying, David, you should know that pretty well, considering you were a shepherd yourself. Verse 8 says, I have been with you, David, whithersoever thou goest. Just as what God had said about Israel in verse 6, wheresoever I walked with all Israel. God is expressing to David, he cannot and will not be bound up in one place. David, I don't need you to build me a house, nor for you to want me to be your next door neighbor, because God is bound to people who love him and who are of his heart. He had been with David wheresoever he had been, whether in the fields with his sheep at a young age or on the battlefield. Yahweh had been there by his side the entire time. Now, this holds an immensely powerful lesson for us. David wanted to build God a house in Jerusalem because he wanted God's presence as close to him as physically possible. But here, God is telling David, no, you building a house for me won't change a thing because I was already with you. My dwelling place is not within bricks or stone, but instead it's within people. It takes us to Psalm 90, verse 1, where the psalmist says, Yahweh, thou hast been our dwelling place for generations. God dwells among us. We dwell with him and he with us. Now, this isn't a new principle that has been revealed to David. It's something that God has demonstrated right throughout his word. And so for our exhort this morning, I want to take a look at a few examples throughout Scripture where God describes where his real dwelling place is. And hopefully we can take away some exhortation, which will lead us to the bread and wine this morning. And one of the most prominent examples, I think, that can demonstrate this, that God dwells with mankind, can be seen right from the very beginning in Genesis 3. So if you can all turn to the beginning of the Bible, back to Genesis chapter 3. We know Genesis 3 pretty well because of our first principles, the promises, because it follows the first sin of man and woman when they take the fruit in verse 8. And verse 8 says, "And they heard the voice of Yahweh Elohim walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh Elohim amongst the trees of the garden." Clearly, from this almost nonchalant statement, it seems as if this was a regular occurrence. The angels, or Yahweh Elohim here, were continually walking throughout the garden. And obviously, the angels were the presence of God. They would regularly dwell and walk within the Garden of Eden with man. And yet here, once they have committed their sin, they hide themselves from his presence because they are ashamed. Now, God happily sent the angel of his presence to walk and dwell amongst Adam and Eve pre-sin. Yet following their sin, we find in verse 23, "Therefore Yahweh Elohim sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from where he was taken." So God drives man from his presence, from the Garden of Eden and from the angels themselves. But this isn't the end of the relationship between God and man, because God continually throughout Scripture shows that he wants and desires for man to dwell with those who are profitable and who can glorify his holy name. Now, one of my favorite examples of this can be seen through the life of Jacob. So come forward with me to Genesis 28, verse 10 to 16. Genesis 28, verse 10 to 16, picks up the story just after Jacob has deceived Isaac to give him the blessing instead of Esau. And now he's on the run from his vengeful brother. The record tells us from verse 10, "And Jacob went out from Beersheba towards Haran, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreams, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached heaven. And behold, the angel of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh Elohim of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed." And then we go to verse 15, "And behold, I am with thee, and I will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee until I have done that which I've spoken to thee of." And so there we have it, brethren and sisters. God promises Jacob in verse 15 that he will be with him whithersoever he goeth. God's dwelling place is temporary too, because he is with us as believers as we meet here today. But also notice in verse 12, something that perhaps has already been pointed out to you before, the order of which the angel is moving. He's ascending and descending. For the angel to ascend first, he had to already have been with Jacob. He had to have been by his side. And so we find here the angel of God, his own representative, is right by Jacob's side. But we see here that Jacob makes the same mistake that David does and so many do in the future. Because we find that Jacob awakes out of his sleep, and what does he say? Surely Yahweh is not with me, But Yahweh is in this place, and I knew it not. Jacob misses this huge penny that has just dropped in front of him. And instead of grasping the obvious fact that God is with him, he thinks that this must be the physical place where he is sleeping, must be the place where God dwells. And so he, therefore, based on his belief, calls the place Bethel, the house of God. Now, Jacob wrestles with this principle for his entire life. I don't think he fully fathoms this until the end of his life. Say, for example, after the events with his uncle Laban in Genesis 31, verse 42. He says, well, except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely you would have sent me away empty. So clearly, Jacob sees that God had been with him. But then we get to chapter 32, if you'd like to turn there. So chapter 32, we find that Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. Now, this seems like such a casual statement, doesn't it? The angels of God met Jacob on his way to meet his brother Esau. Clearly, this is a show to Jacob that God's presence is right with him during this difficult time. Now, surely Jacob then understands now that God has been dwelling with him this entire time. Well, no, because he marvels and says, well, this is God's host. And he calls the place Mahanaim. Now, you might have in your margins, Mahanaim means two hosts, not one united host where God is with Jacob. Instead, he sees God as a separate entity to him. To reinforce this even further, to understand the principle that God was working in his life, we find that at the end of this chapter, that in the face of certain defeat, he wrestles with an angel. And with a dislocated femur, he refuses to let the angel go because he wants his presence to be with him until he gives him a blessing. It took Jacob all his life to understand the principle that God was working with him, that he was truly dwelling alongside him. God wasn't left at Bethel all those years ago. He was instead present and working with Jacob his entire life. And we see this at the end of his life in Genesis 48. Come over there with me. This is a great quote. Genesis 48 and verse 15 and 16. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from evil, bless the lads. It's a touching story of how it took Jacob almost 100 years to understand and recognize that God was dwelling right alongside him. The theme of God's dwelling place continues right into the Exodus account during the wilderness wanderings, where he asked the children of Israel to create for him a tabernacle, or his dwelling place. What never ceases to amaze me is that the tabernacle is that God spends one verse on the creation of all the stars in the universe, and yet he spends 15 chapters on the establishment and creation of a tent. And this is because God has a very similarly strained message in Exodus. Exodus 25, verse 8. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Exodus 29, verse 45. I will dwell among them. Exodus 40, verse 38. For the cloud of Yahweh was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeyings. And so here, at the very end of Exodus 40, we find that God's glory was literally in the middle, dwelling amongst the congregation. Now, God uses these visual symbols to show how his people, Israel, that he literally dwells within them. There are countless references to it in the law, such as Deuteronomy 23, verse 14. God instructs Israel to keep his camp clean and holy. Why? because Yahweh thy God walks in the midst of the camp to deliver thee. These are just some of the lessons that God has used in the past to demonstrate that he dwells alongside our ancient forefathers. He dwelt alongside them, and nothing has changed this time. That David, God dwells with you too. We find after this lesson in 1 Chronicles 17 that clearly David grasped hold of it. He gets it now. And we see that in Psalm 139, if you'd like to turn there. Because we see that David's appreciation and praise to God is being involved in every aspect of his life. So Psalm 139, verse 1. O Yahweh, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down sitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thoughts afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Verse 7, where shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? And verse 10, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. And so here we have perhaps one of the simplest lessons that we teach our children, and we were taught when we were in Sunday school. Question 1, who made all things? God. Question 2, where is God? In heaven. Question 3, is he anywhere else? Yes, he is everywhere. But despite this being one of the easiest concepts that we learn as children, we sometimes turn such a blind eye to it in adulthood. Just look at the 4 examples that we've looked at this morning. Adam and Eve, Jacob, Israel, and David. All of them were acutely aware that God's presence dwelt amongst them. They saw evidence of it in so many aspects in their lives. Yet all of them neglected and spent portions of their life pretending that this wasn't the case. Adam and Eve did it when they took the fruit, thinking that they wouldn't be caught. Jacob did it with his uncle Laban, trying to play things to his own advantage, that it was his own skill that was getting him all this gain and wealth. Israel did it with their murmuring, even though they could see the pillar of cloud of fire in the midst of them. And right after 1 Chronicles 17, David throws it away with Bathsheba. How would this consideration change our motives and lives if we were acutely sensitive to the fact that God desired to dwell with us? Would we be so apathetic to committing sin? Would we so quickly turn away from the opportunity to speak with a work colleague about the promises that are coming to pass? Would we be so easily distracted with the possessions and glory of this modern age that we live in? We find in chapter 17 of 1 Chronicles that David had an earnest desire, here and now, to have God dwelling with him. Do we have this same desire within our secret moments as we leave for work? This is a truly amazing and encouraging fact. Although there is this awe of negativity that God is watching every sin that we commit, there is an amazing encouragement behind all of this. God doesn't just want to dwell here in the Moorebank Ecclesial Hall, because if he did, our meetings over COVID would have been absolutely useless. Instead, he is here with us today, and he will be when we go to our homes. He will hearken to our prayers. He will monitor our hearts, and as we remember his son today. It also provides us with comfort in all our endeavors in life, in our sorrows, our struggles, and our fears. God is dutifully overlooking and watching our paths to ensure there is guidance and care, because he wants to be right there, right next to you. But is this unconditional? No matter who we are or what we do, does God always want to dwell with us? Well, the answer, just like your own house, is, well, you love your house because, well, it's homely. It's desirable to be lived in. It suits your every day-to-day needs and purposes. It becomes your pride and joy. You spend hours working on your home. It comes to life because it is your home, and it holds your most precious jewels and values. And God is exactly the same. He wants his dwelling place to be all of these things. He's continually working on it. He continually desires to live in us. And clearly, we know from Scripture that God doesn't stay with people unconditionally. We just need to take a look at King David's predecessor, Saul. We find that in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14, that the Spirit of God departs from Saul. And this was his refusal to learn obedience before God. And so severe was the separation between God and Saul that even in his last moments in 1 Samuel 28, when he inquires of God, God returns a deafening silence to his pleas and cries. Come with me to Isaiah 66, verse 1 to 2. Clearly, the lesson of Saul is obedience. God will be with us if we are obedient. However, Isaiah says that there is more than this as an indication of who God wishes to dwell with. So Isaiah 66 and verse 1 and 2. Thus saith Yahweh, the heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye build unto me? And where is the place of my rest? For all those things hath my hand made, and all those things which have been, saith Yahweh. But to this man will I look, even to him that is of a poor and of a contrite spirit, and he that trembleth at my word. How similar are these to the messages which God teaches David in 1 Chronicles 17 and 2 Samuel 7? I have no need of a physical house, he says to Isaiah. But what I do want, who I do regard or look to, is the man of a poor and contrite spirit, who is meek, who is crushed small, who is reverent to my word. And in him, that is who I can make my home. And so that is our two-part exhort today. First part, do we have a desire that God dwells with us? We have to want it, like how David did. And then if we do want it, we have to be like this man here in Isaiah 66, one with a poor and contrite heart. And brothers and sisters, we both know that you're not like that and I'm not like that, not perfectly at least. This spirit of humility and humbleness is what we need to cleanse our own house if we want to make room for God. And when we do have this spirit of humility, the result is Psalm 38, verse 17 to 19. The righteous cry, and Yahweh heareth. He delivereth them out of all their troubles. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth them with a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but Yahweh delivereth him out of them all. Once again, this is actually David speaking, and he truly understands how dependent we are, or we should be, on God. We are humble enough to accept him, and to be broken and contrite, God will deliver us out of any affliction or trouble we might be in. Now, Paul already tells us that we are the temple of God in 2 Corinthians 6. He says, ye are the temple of the living God, and I will dwell in them and walk with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. We can also be this if we are compatible for God to dwell in, to work on his character, and to manifest his glory. And so we come to the emblems now in front of us. So come with me to Matthew 1, verse 20 to 23. Matthew chapter 1, verse 20 to 23. But while Joseph thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Now, all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet of the Lord, by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin shall be with child, shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. This is who Christ was, our intercessor and mediator that we've come to remember today. Emmanuel, the one who manifested every quality of God and showed that God can completely dwell within a man's life. And that is the hope we have for us. We see the Christ in Matthew 11, verse 29. He's expressed as being meek, lowly in heart, where we can find rest for our souls, just like the man in Isaiah 66. He has therefore been able to reconcile us with our Creator. He has set a path for us to be reunited with God so that he can perfectly dwell with us, that we might be with him and he with us forevermore. And so that is where 1 Chronicles 17 continues to show. Not only does God not dwell in a house, he is the one who builds the house. He was the one who was going to build the house for David and whose throne would be established forever. But in what house would it be established? It was a spiritual house of Christ, which of course we can be a part of. So as we go through this week, be grateful and remember the dwelling place that you live in, and begin to become more conscious once more that you share that dwelling place with Yahweh, God of all the earth, and that he has a willingness to dwell with you at all times. Let this transform you like that it transformed David, who wrote psalms and prayers acknowledging the ever-near presence of Yahweh, his God, in his life. Use the power behind this reality, knowing that God is with us right here, right now, and wake up every morning knowing that God is dwelling with you, and let that fact change who you are. Be encouraged, sin not. Be a dwelling place that God can call his pride and joy, where he can store his prized possessions, characteristics of humility, of meekness, a contrite spirit, and look to his only begotten Son, who demonstrated that God did dwell and was powerfully present in all of his life. And this is our ultimate aim and focus, where David's greater son, Emmanuel, who laid down his life in sacrifice, will unite us with the Father. Let's turn up a final quote and let's end here. Revelation 21, verse 1 to 3. And John writes, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth was passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of the heavens saying, Behold, the tabernacle, or the dwelling place of God, is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. Thanks.